First of all, for those of you who don't already know, I want to say that the League of Women Voters is a national organization with over 800 local and state chapters, and we love to have both men and women join. We have men on our board. We're proud of that, and if you're not a member, we do have information for you. The League is nonpartisan, but we are a political organization because we encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues. Hello? Better? Okay. And we like to influence public policy. We do this in two ways, through education and through advocacy, which are two different efforts. Tonight we're working on education. So we sponsor these programs throughout the year, and we also host candidate debates before the elections. So this coming fall, our first debate will be on Sunday, September 28th, Lake County administrative offices like the sheriff and clerk, and on October 5th we will be having some debates for U.S. offices, the 10th Congressional District and the 59th State Representative District. So we'll have more information available on that, but you can always go to our website, which is LWVLFLB. You can Google it. That's League of Women Voters, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, LWVLFLB. So tonight's program is partially funded by a coastal grant from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources to our State League of Illinois. And we have developed presentations and education materials covering stormwater problems and solutions for communities throughout the state. So we've had plenty of rain already this June and more tonight. Our room is kind of flooded, but that's because the wind is driving it in horizontally. We're in beautiful Elawa Farms, which is very nice and wonderful and beautiful and tidy, but the weather is conspiring to bring the water in and keep us on subject, I suppose. So if you would like to make a donation tonight, we're always glad to accept that, and also at any time. But we do have three wonderful speakers, and that's the reason you came, so I'd like to get to that. They will each make individual presentations. We will take questions. We also have a rain barrel that some lucky person will win. The rain barrel is helpfully labeled Free Garden Rain. It's right there. Free water. And we will have that drawing right before the questions. So, without ado, I'd like to introduce one of our several speakers. Our first speaker will be Krista Grimm, and she is the Water Resources Specialist for the League of Women Voters of Illinois. She has been working on water issues for a long time. I'd like to give you a special shout out, Krista, because you followed your bliss, created this program, sought the funding to take it on the road, and that is why we are here tonight, because one person just decided it needed to be done. So thank you for coming and listening. Krista is well-educated with a Master's of Urban Planning and Policy, so tonight she is acting locally and thinking globally and is going to give us our first presentation on stormwater. Thank you, Krista.
Before I get started with the presentation, go ahead to the next slide. I just wanted to talk about the Illinois Department of Natural Resources joined the National Coastal Management Program for the first time. The program started last year. We got grant funding in the first round for this project. I just wanted to show you what the coastal zone is in Illinois. It's very narrow, as you can see. The largest area is in Lake County, where it extends from the coast to approximately Green Bay Road, and then it's pretty much Lakeshore Drive through Chicago, and then it kind of gets wider down in the south where it incorporates Lake Calumet. If you go to the next slide. And then this is in Lake Forest here. The municipal boundaries aren't on here, but you can see that, you know, I've captured it. And the orange line is the boundary of the coastal zone. So it's Green Bay Road to Westlake, and then it goes down to Sheridan Road. And the significance of this is that this is the area, this is the Lake Michigan watershed in Lake Forest. This area in the coastal zone, the water that falls on it drains into Lake Michigan. So it's good to know. Okay, next slide. Okay, we have a problem, and that is that in the Midwest, one of the consequences of climate change is more frequent and intense rainstorms that are leading to more frequent and intense flooding. In Illinois, heavy downpours are already twice as frequent as they were a century ago, and the storms are leading to flooding and increased stormwater runoff. Go ahead. In a natural area, on average, 50% of the rainwater that falls is absorbed by the ground, with about half of that recharging the groundwater. About 40% will evaporate, and about 10% will become runoff. Of course, these percentages are just averages, and they're very dependent on the local conditions wherever the rain is falling. So it's dependent on the topography, if it's steep or if it's flat. Other things like what kind of soil there is there, if we have clay or if it's very sandy soil. Even the temperature and the climate will affect how much is absorbed by the ground and how much evaporates and how much runs off. In a moderate rainfall, if the amount of runoff might mean that there's some kind of puddling going on because water looks for the depressions and fills the depressions. It's seeking its level. It's only in more severe storms that runoff accumulates in an amount that would cause a flood. Okay, go ahead. In those larger rainfalls, excess stormwater flows to wetlands. There are several types of wetlands. Some are dry most of the year and only become wet during the rainy season, and others are wet all year long. Wetlands are important to us because, first of all, they're a rich source of habitat for wildlife and native plants, but they're also important for the services that they provide for us. They detain stormwater, as I said, but they also clean the water. Microorganisms in plant roots and soil transform contaminants in the water and make them harmless. The water is further cleaned as it infiltrates the ground and it's filtered by soil particles. Okay. Where we have constructed houses, buildings, streets, parking lots, and other hard surfaces that prevent water from ever reaching the soil, nearly all the rain that doesn't evaporate becomes runoff. This picture is a highly urbanized area like downtown Chicago, and it shows that on average in this kind of location, 55% of the rainfall will become runoff. But even in an area where you have 50% coverage by impervious surfaces, you will have increased runoff, approximately 30%. In order to prevent constant flooding in this kind of situation, we have constructed drains and sewers to collect and remove the runoff. Okay, go ahead. And we call this gray infrastructure. In Lake County, we have what is known as a separated sewer system. So there's actually two sets of sewers. There's the sanitary sewers that removed wastewater from our houses. The sanitary sewers remove the waste from our houses, and that's totally separate from the sewers that remove and collect stormwater. Most stormwater systems have been designed to handle 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, and so when we have heavier rain, that's when flooding may occur. These systems were originally designed and installed, most parts of the system, when the community was originally developed. The population was much smaller and we had less land coverage overall. This is another reason that we experience more flooding. So the population of Lake County in 1970, so even, Lake County obviously started developing much earlier than that, but just to show that there's been huge population growth here. 1970, the population was 383,000, and in 2012, 702,000. So over 300,000 people moved to the area in the last 40 years. One other thing about gray infrastructure. It serves us well for the most part. But it does have limitations, and one limitation is that it has been designed to meet to certain specifications, and as I said, that's usually 2 inches of rain in 24 hours. So we could have a system that could handle more water, but we have a lot of money already invested in the infrastructure that's there, and it would be very expensive to replace it. The other thing is that the system is largely inaccessible because it's buried and it's very disruptive when we need to maintain it or fix it or replace it. Okay. Okay. So now runoff is a problem for us besides the flooding problems. It's a source of the non-point source pollution. This is a term that the government created after the Clean Water Act was put in. There was the first focus was to look at sources of pollution, water pollution. And so this was like factories, construction sites that were directly discharging water, wastewater with contaminants in it. So focusing on those kinds of sources of water pollution did a lot to clean up our water, but we still have additional problems. So now there is a greater focus on looking at non-point source pollution. So it's non-source point. It's kind of a funny term because it describes what it's not, but it's from very diffuse sources. So it's like, this is the kind of thing that we're all contributing to. It's coming from all over, and you know, it's not like you can just target one point to address the problem. So when stormwater falls and it runs over the ground, it's picking up pollutants. So from roofs and gutters, it's picking up things like heavy metals and zinc from the gutters. From hard surfaces like streets, where it picks up motor oil, gasoline, asbestos from car brakes. And from vegetated areas like backyards, parks, golf courses, it's picking up things like fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all those things. So as the water moves through the environment and collects, it's collecting those different pollutants. Okay. Another problem or source of contamination of stormwater actually comes from the sewer system. Even though we have a separated sewer system where there's two sets of pipes, they're typically built, constructed so that the pipes are very close together. Over time, there are faults in the pipes so that there's little cracks, there's tree roots that get into them, and other reasons why there's a little breakdown in the system. And especially when the ground is saturated with water, the waste is leaking out of the sanitary pipes, and rainwater is mixing with it and getting into the stormwater pipes. And then we have pollution, we have contamination with raw waste. Okay. So this, of course, causes problems for our environment. Here, one of the results is that we have beach warnings and closures, and we have water impairment problems with our beach water. So under the Clean Water Act, in every even-numbered year, the state assesses the quality of water in the different waterways and at beaches. And 2 years ago, in 2012, the state assessed the water at all of the beaches in Illinois, and the result was that they were all found to be impaired with E. coli. So they're impaired for primary contact, which, you know, swimming, basically, you know, people having direct contact with the water. This does not mean that we can't use the water, but the levels of E. coli might be harmful, or, you know, people with impaired immune systems might want to be a little careful about going in the water. But typically, there's water monitoring going on all the time, water forecasting, and so there will be beach warnings and closures if they find that that it's unsafe on the beach, the water quality is unsafe. The area beaches were also found to be impaired for fish consumption because of the pollutants mercury and PCBs. Another problem caused by stormwater is erosion. Now this is just a picture of the ravine erosion, and it happened to be a restoration project in Lake Bluff. So on the left you can see that if we don't have a if we have a degraded environmental quality, ecosystem quality, that there's nothing there to really slow down the water, and the stormwater runoff picks up speed. So erosion is a natural process, but in this kind of instance where there's nothing to slow down the water, erosion will happen more quickly. You can see that there's nothing there to slow it down, and it's just going to get faster and faster. And you can kind of see the color in the picture that the water is brown, because those soil particles are also being removed and causing sedimentation and silt, and which is an unhealthy for aquatic life that would be in the waterway. That would be brought into the lake in that instance. And then after renovation, when the ecosystem is much higher quality, you can see that the water will be traveling more slowly. And then the plants and those rocks and the soil will be able to do the services for us of cleaning that water, because more water will be able to infiltrate the ground. Okay? In Cook County, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Chicago, a lot of the miles of their sewers are combined sewer system, so the sanitary waste and stormwater is being mixed in one sewage pipe. And when the system becomes too full and there's pressure on it, the MWRD does discharges into local area waterways, and Kurt's going to talk about those, but I just wanted to explain that so that I could talk about this. When there's even greater pressure on the system because the rainwater is there's so much volume of it, then they have to do a reversal of they reversed the direction of the Chicago River, as I'm sure you're all aware, but then they have to open the locks and let that pressure out into Lake Michigan. So these opening of the locks, happily, they don't occur very often. There's some years they have not had to do them at all, and then other years they've had to open the locks as many as 3 times. But as you can see on the right, it seems as though the volume of the outflow, this is raw sewage mixed with rainwater, that they're putting into the lake seems to be increasing. So we hope that's not a trend. And of course, that is something that's happening in Cook County, but it affects Lake Michigan, so that affects all of us. Okay, so I've come here and I've explained about stormwater and some of the problems that stormwater cause, and I just could not end on that negative note, so I had to, I had to throw in some good stuff. We have invested in this gray infrastructure system, and we're going to continue to maintain it and invest in it. But there is consensus that we need to augment that system, and we're doing that with green infrastructure. So green infrastructure mimics wetlands and natural processes. It helps keep water from ever hitting the ground. It helps keep water on site so it doesn't get into the sewer system. And it often uses plants. And the most important thing to know is that it is infrastructure. So the EPA has recently released a report from a demonstration project it did in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that shows that green infrastructure is effective and cost-effective in dealing with stormwater in an urban environment. As part of our education project, we have done a lot of research and collected a lot of resources on things that individuals can do with green infrastructure at their own homes. And Sarah is going to talk about many of those things. So I'm not, but I did wanted to let you know that we have put together a stormwater action kit on our website. This is actually the website of the League of Women Voters Lake Michigan region. So that's where those letters come from, lwvlmr.org. And you can click on those pictures there halfway down the page, and you can find out pretty much everything you'd need to know to implement one of these green infrastructure strategies. And then I also wanted to mention, just beyond what individuals can do with their own homes, that there is a movement toward doing community and regional measures with green infrastructure. And as an example, the Illinois Department of Transportation is doing a demonstration project along I-294, starting at Toohey and going up to Sanders Road, of doing bioswale along the tollway, which will catch some of the salts that come off of and the other pollutants that will be coming off the tollway. So this is fantastic, and I hope that we'll be seeing more of this in the future. And that concludes my section. Thank you for your attention.
We have two more wonderful speakers. I want to share some thoughts with you. Our next presenter is Kurt Volkman. He's the chairman of the Lake Forest Collaborative for Environmental Leadership, formerly chairman of the Lake Forest Parks and Rec Board. He's employed by Environmental Law and Policy Center, where he works on items like clean water, energy, transportation issues. Before that, a long career at Accenture, where his role was most recently managing director of the North American Strategy and Sustainability Consulting practice that they had. So I'm happy to welcome him. He holds an MBA from Berkeley and is here to chat with us. Thank you, Kurt. Why don't you come right up?
Mary asked me to spend just a couple minutes talking a bit about the Lake Forest Collaborative and explain to you who we are and what we're doing. So I'd like to begin with that. Beginning with a little bit of history. Lake Forest has a long tradition of environmental stewardship, going back to our founding in 1861 when we established our motto in Latin, which translates into love of nature and science, or love of nature and learning. In 2012, we developed the city's strategic plan and had a whole chapter with a commitment to environmental stewardship. And this included objectives on things like promoting education and sustainable practices to preserve and protect the environment, to expand our recycling, and to encourage energy efficiency. Last year, our mayor, Don Schoenheider, signed the Sierra Club Cool Cities Sustainability Agreement that renews Lake Forest's commitment to continued emissions reductions through energy efficiency and renewable energy, water conservation, local food production, recycling and composting, and alternative transportation. So to help achieve the objectives of the strategic plan and the Cool Cities Sustainability Agreement, we formed the Lake Forest Collaborative for Environmental Leadership. This is a volunteer group that has representatives from the institutions that are shown here: the city staff, Lake Forest College, our two school districts, and Lake Forest Open Lands Association. Each of the organizations has assigned a primary and a secondary representative, and we draw on the resources from each of the organizations as we implement various projects. Our specific goals are the following: to promote awareness of environmental concerns such as water quality, ravine and bluff degradation, invasive species, air quality issues, tree disease and pest threats, and the need for the reduction of waste. Secondly, to develop and promote awareness of community-wide projects and programs aimed at improving our natural environment and quality of life. Third, to engage a network of resident volunteers to take action to address environmental issues and to manage the natural resources of the city. And lastly, to assist in the development of responsible environmental standards, city ordinances and policies, and the promotion of educational awareness of environmental practices in our communities. So awareness and engagement are kind of the guiding principles of our collaborative. Our steering committee met for the first time and identified 3 areas of focus, or 3 broad projects that we're working on right now. The first is what we're calling re-greening of Lake Forest. And this is in response to the severe impact of the emerald ash borer on our tree canopy. We're expecting to lose nearly 100,000 ash trees over the next 10 years. We're working closely with city staff to inform residents of their treatment and removal options and to encourage replanting of diverse but native species so we're best prepared for the next wave of pests or diseases. Next, we recently received a grant from the Illinois Coastal Management Program to develop a ravine education and restoration program primarily focused on Seminary Ravine. This is the ravine that goes from the college down to the south end of Forest Park, down by the beach. I'll show you a map in just a second. Lastly, we're developing an education series that we're calling Where Does It Come From and Where Does It Go? To help our residents better understand some of the details about our environment and natural resources that many people really don't think about. Much of the information I'm going to share with you tonight came from the water series that we developed last fall. Later this year, we're going to develop an energy series, and next year we'll tackle solid waste. So let's talk about water. Before we discuss the specifics of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff, I think it's really important to understand the broader context of what's called the Chicago Area Waterway System, and Krista talked about this a bit. It's important to understand where water flows in our area. Krista mentioned the reversal of the Chicago River in 1900, which essentially means that water is diverted or withdrawn from the lake. It's called the Chicago Diversion. It actually takes place in 3 locations, in Wilmette, in Chicago, and in Calumet. And legally, up to 2.1 billion, that's billion gallons of water a day can be withdrawn from the lake and sent on its way down through the Illinois River to the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. 2.1 billion gallons a day. This also means that anything that finds its way into the Skokie River or the Middle Fork branch Middle Fork of the North Branch of the Chicago River, which is right out here, this is up where we live, also finds its way to the Chicago River, to the Illinois River, to the Mississippi River, to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? I'll explain in a bit why that's important. I'd also like to make some quick comments on our fresh and wastewater systems, because for us in Lake Bluff and Lake Forest, fresh, waste, and stormwater are very, very interrelated. As you probably all know, Lake Michigan is the source of drinking water for both Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. Lake Bluff is a member of the Central Lake County Joint Action Water Agency, or JAWA they call it, which supplies treated Lake Michigan water to the community. The JAWA water plant is the 3rd largest in Illinois and the newest along Lake Michigan. It's capable of purifying 50 million gallons of water a day in this plant on Rockland Road that you see here. The picture on the left is an aerial view of Lake Forest's water plant. It actually sits right down on the beach. It was originally constructed by private residents in 1890, and it was called the Lake Forest Water Company. The city purchased it from those residents in 1921, and it became a city asset. So right outside the plant, about a half a mile and about a 3/4 mile out into the lake, are intake pipes that actually draw water using gravity into the plant where it's purified, and then there are pumps that push it up the hill into the rest of Lake Forest. Now, unlike JAWA, the Lake Forest plant is kind of hidden. The entrance to the plant is actually at the intersection of Lake Road and Spruce Avenue. And this is the entrance gate right here. So many of you have probably driven by that and just assumed that there's some big old house beyond the gate, but that's actually the entrance to our water plant. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, the city staff conduct great tours of that facility, and it's actually very fascinating to go down there and check it out. Another important characteristic that Krista mentioned, please next, about our sanitary and storm sewers, as Krista said, we have separate systems, and this is really important. And it's an advantage that we have in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff because, as Krista mentioned, there are lots of communities in Chicagoland and great portions of the city of Chicago that have combined sewer and stormwater systems. The separate systems that we have avoid the combined sewer overflows that Krista talked about, where they have to dump water into the lake. It causes other problems, which I'll get to in a second. All of our wastewater, so this is what we flush and what goes down the drains in our bathtubs and our sinks, that's our wastewater. All of it in Lake Bluff and in Lake Forest ends up in a big pipe that's buried underneath Highway 41. It heads south, and it ends up in the North Shore Sanitary District Treatment Plant, which is on Clavey Road in Highland Park. There's a series of processes at this plant that separate the solid waste from the liquid waste. And ultimately, the liquid waste, the water is cleaned and sanitized. Chicago River, the Illinois River, Mississippi River, Gulf of Mexico. You're gonna get tired of that before the end of the night. Krista mentioned this briefly, that one of the other unique characteristics about Lake Forest and Lake Bluff is that we sit on a subcontinental divide between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed, with Green Bay Road being kind of a natural divider. So Green Bay Road is a subcontinental divide. This means, as Krista explained, that a drop of water that lands on the east side of Green Bay Road will naturally find its way through the ravines into Lake Michigan. A drop of water that lands on the west side of Green Bay Road will naturally find its way to either the Skokie River or the middle fork of the north branch of the Chicago River. Okay? However, as we've increasingly seen, during heavy rain events, we have flooding problems. Here are a couple photos of Deer Path Golf Course from May of this year after we had a series of rains. This poor guy's trying to figure out how he's going to putt. It's understandable that we have water challenges because Illinois is fundamentally a wetland state. And Lake Forest and Lake Bluff are wetland communities. Krista explained what wetlands are. This map shows that prior to settlement and development, almost a third of our land in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff was a wetland. This meant that rainwater stayed on the ground where it fell until it slowly dissipated, which is really nature's way of managing stormwater. Our ancestors and other settlers didn't think this was acceptable, and when they considered how to make the land more valuable, they concluded it was important to get the water off the land as quickly as possible. So they installed elaborate tile drainage systems, channelized our ditches, and directed our stormwater to rivers and ravines to efficiently get the water off our farms, yards, and roads. Tile drainage in the Mississippi Basin is one of the great advances of the 19th and 20th centuries because it allows highly productive agriculture on land that was once too wet to farm. In fact, installation of new drainage systems continues every year because it leads to increased crop yields. This shows a typical drainage scheme for farmland that's common throughout Illinois. This also means that we've lost over 90% of our wetlands to farmland. Watch this closely, next one. Those are our wetlands today. So we went from nearly 3,000 acres to just over 250 acres of wetland in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. And we now have a stormwater management system that's designed to quickly send the water elsewhere. And this is causing all kinds of problems. As we've said, on the east side of town, stormwater flows through storm sewers into the ravines and then into Lake Michigan. This map shows the major ravines in Lake Forest. There are actually 15 separate ravines covering about 13 miles in Lake Forest of ravines. I mentioned earlier Seminary Ravine, where the education project is taking place. That's this one here. The college is here. This is Forest Park, the beach down here. So this is where our project is focused. I also want to point out this coloring, the kind of salmon color are privately owned properties, whereas green is owned by the city, and down here this is Lake County Forest Preserve. So takeaway here is the vast majority of the ravines in Lake Forest are on private land, which limits our ability to improve them. This is a typical outflow structure that drains stormwater into a ravine. Now, stormwater returning to Lake Michigan is not necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, it's a good thing. But what's happening, and Krista said this as well, is that whatever fertilizer you put on your lawn that goes unused, or any car wash that goes down the street drain, or any soil that's washed away from your yard, or any other water you redirect from your gutters or your parking lots, heads untreated to the ravines into Lake Michigan, our source of drinking water. It's also the volume of stormwater that's causing a lot of problems, specifically erosion, as Krista mentioned, ravine instability, and the destruction of very rare ravine habitat. In addition to the destruction, the erosion is sending our very valuable soil downstream. You can see the erosion along the bank here of this ravine. Next. And you can really see it here, where it's actually causing the trees to topple over. These are PVC pipes that some homeowner would have run down to put the water directly in the ravine. You see the erosion along here. Next one. This is McCormick Ravine. You see we're about to lose this tree. That tree is pretty much dead already. So lots of destruction from the volume of water. During a storm event, the amount of water rushing through our storm sewer lines and ravines into the lake is quite intense and can sometimes significantly reshape the beach. The volume of sediment in the runoff can also be significant, as shown here by the plume at the mouth of Seminary Ravine after a moderate rainstorm 2 weeks ago. I was down there for another reason, and we just had some rain, and you can kind of see this. That's all sediment that's washed down through the ravine. Finally, there can be significant damage to the bluffs from these volumes of water. You may have heard about the collapse of the bluffs at Fort Sheridan in May after a series of heavy rains. The Lake County Forest Preserve doesn't really know what happened, other than the ground was very saturated, and they believe that the underground pipe that went from a retention pond emptying into the lake perhaps had failed. But we now have a 50-foot deep crater and a mess at the beach. Next one. Note the sediment plume that's in that location now too. This was Saturday I was out there. Next. So this was a year ago at that same location on the beach, looking at that outfall structure. This is the way it was supposed to work. This is that hill. This is the outlet. Next one. This is what it looks like now. It's a big mess. Last but not least, and Krista mentioned this, stormwater runoff is the #1 cause of beach closures. The Natural Resources Defense Council released a report this month, in addition to the studies that Krista cited, that compared water quality at beaches across the country. Illinois ranked 15th out of 30 states for beach water quality. Lake Forest Beach was particularly troublesome. We had in 2013, 13% of all of the water quality samples exceeded the daily maximum threshold for bacteria. I'm happy to say that Sunrise Beach at Lake Bluff only had 2% of its samples that violated the threshold. So what causes closing of the beaches? Well, it's E. coli bacteria in the water, which is mostly avian and wildlife generated. So testing has shown that waste from animals and gull droppings in the stormwater runoff are the primary source. It may also be infiltration, as Krista mentioned, and perhaps some stormwater overflow from cities to the north, like Milwaukee. But what happens during a storm event is E. coli in our lawns and gardens, in the lake sediment and the sand, gets stirred up and washed off into the water, contaminating the water and causing the closing of the beach. One more fun fact to consider. The retention time for Lake Michigan, which is the time it takes for an element or a substance to naturally cycle out of a lake, is 99 years. This means that whatever's dumped into the lake today is going to be around for my great-great-grandchildren to have to deal with. So we have issues with substantial erosion and instability of ravines and bluffs, reduced water quality and damage to plant life and habitat. So if you live east of Green Bay Road, please remember there is a direct connection between your driveway and Lake Michigan, the source of our drinking water. As I said earlier, in the west side of town, storm sewers direct water either to the Skokie River or the middle fork of the North Branch of the Chicago River. Next one, please. Here's a shot of the beautiful Skokie River, or the Skokie Ditch, as most people call it now. Skokie River didn't used to be straight. It used to meander. It was a lot more attractive. But our predecessors reconstructed it, again, to get the water off the landscape as quickly as possible, because a straight channel is the best way to do that. Here's a shot of the same river overflowing after a major storm this spring. You can see, you really can't see the banks. And you can just imagine the erosion and property damage associated with that. Let me give you an example of property damage. Next one. This is a house, this is the backyard of a house that sits on the Skokie River. And you can see all of the erosion of their backyard. Now, this family has lived in this house about 8 years, and they estimate that they've lost about 6 feet of their backyard from this erosion in 8 years. You can also see that this wood pole, which supports cable wires and ComEd wires, is now sitting in the river. Less than 2 years ago, I walked by here frequently, and that pole was actually on the bank, and now it's sitting in the river. Next one. Here's another shot from their backyard, and you can see, here's the pole sitting in the river. There's actually a ComEd cable that now nicely runs in the water before coming underground to the house. I asked them if ComEd had actually been out to take care of this, and they said they had. All they did was put up some guy wires to keep the pole from collapsing. So this is a great example of the property damage we're experiencing in town from the storm overflow that's shooting straight through the Skokie River and the Middle Fork Branch. I'd like to just briefly go from local issues to a very important national issue. Stay there. Go back, please. There's a concept called the dead zone, and it's one of the toughest environmental problems facing America. For the last 20 years, scientists have documented the appearance of a summertime dead zone that all but obliterates marine life in one of the country's most important fisheries, the Gulf of Mexico. Go ahead. Each year, the dead zone grows to an area that's roughly the size of New Jersey, ranging from about 5,000 to 8,000 square miles. What causes this? An annual flood of wasted fertilizer, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, from heavily farmed land running into the rivers and finally into the Gulf, where it feeds the development of a massive algae bloom. The algae then die and decompose, robbing the water of oxygen and suffocating all marine life that can't escape. In 2009, the U.S. Geological Survey identified the top polluting watersheds in the Mississippi River Basin that caused the dead zone. I'm sad and perhaps embarrassed to report that the watershed containing Chicago is the #1 contributor of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, which reaches the Gulf via the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. Next one. It's the combination of runoff from our yards and gardens mixed with treated wastewater, which often contains phosphorus and nitrates, mixed with fertilizer-rich runoff from our very productive corn and soybean fields that are the worst contributors to the problem in the Gulf, as you can see here by the dark brown and black in Illinois. So let's summarize. Next, please. Our drinking, bathing, and irrigation water comes from Lake Michigan. Next. What we flush or wash down the sink or tub ends up where? Gulf of Mexico. Very good. And finally, our stormwater runoff ends up in, it depends, right? Yep, go ahead. If you're on the east, if you're east of Green Bay Road, it's the ravines in Lake Michigan. If you're west of Green Bay Road, it ultimately finds its way to the Gulf of Mexico. Scientists tell us that we face an increasing frequency of intense rainfall events over the coming years. And the problems I describe will only get worse if we do nothing. Go ahead. Next time you're putting fertilizer on your lawn, ask yourself, do I really need it? Or can I use less? Because otherwise it just goes to a storm drain, to the ravines in the lake, or to the Gulf, and they certainly don't need it downstream. If you live on a ravine, next please, on one of those private properties that I showed you earlier that has a ravine on it, and you care about these issues, and you have the resources to improve the quality of the ravine, please see me afterwards. This is one example on Walden Ravine where the homeowner cares deeply about this, and they've actually fixed the erosion problem in that portion of the ravine. There are solutions available to address this. If you are interested, please see me afterwards. There's a lot of good stuff out there. And unlike what our ancestors did to move the water away from where it stands as quickly as possible, today's challenge is exactly the opposite. We must try to keep stormwater where it stands as much as possible and stop causing additional problems downstream.
Our next speaker, Sarah Sorose, will bring us yet another perspective on stormwater. She is the Conservation and Outreach Director at Conserve Lake County. She's been working on land and water projects in Lake County for a quarter century. She helps Conserve Lake County and others on a variety of stewardship projects, open space properties, natural areas, farmland, residential properties, and larger landscape sites. She has a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin. Her yard is officially recognized by the National Wildlife Federation as a certified wildlife habitat and is also certified through Conservation at Home, which is a really fun program. Sarah's team can come right out to your private property and tell you what you can do. It's an eco-friendly landscaping program available in much of the Chicago region, and Sarah runs it in Lake County. So, if we are ready, I'd like to welcome Sarah to the microphone.
So I'm with Conserve Lake County. We are a 501c3 nonprofit group. Next year we celebrate our 20th anniversary, and that's pretty exciting. We do a lot of good work. We have a lot of fun. I invite you to join us. What we do is help the many people throughout Lake County who care about clean water and healthy land for a better life. And it's pretty exciting. I've been with the group for almost 10 years now. I love it. So please give some thought to joining us. Back in the old days, before this land was settled, when it used to rain on a night like this, that water would usually soak into the ground, it would be absorbed by plants, or it would flow into one of the very many wetlands, lakes, ponds that Lake County is famous for, that it's named for. And we don't have that happening quite so much anymore. Whether or not there is climate change, there's a lot more opportunities for the land to rush off the surface of the ground and get put into our storm sewer system quickly. And as we've heard, that can create some problems. So why don't we turn to solutions now and see what people can do. I'm going to introduce you to a variety of solutions. What's very important to keep in mind is this is not a one-size-fits-all. There's quite a variety of things to choose from depending on your property. Every property is different, and every property owner is different. And so that's important to keep in mind. Another important consideration here is that we're talking about your property. This is one of the largest investments that most of us make. This is your home. It's where you live, where you relax and entertain, where your kids play on the lawn and maybe your dogs too. And so it says a lot about who you are, and it's on display 24/7. So it's not easy to change it. It's not cheap to change it either sometimes. And so you want to be very careful about the things you do with it. And you always, of course, want to make sure you're improving your property and that it's both functional and beautiful. Next, please. Your property also says a lot about your values. It says a lot about how you view the planet and how you view your commitment to the future of your family and the future of your community. No pressure, right? And so as we talk about these things, give some thought also to not just your home property, but other properties that you might influence, whether it's a corporate campus or a schoolyard, or maybe it's municipal property. My hunch is that if you're here tonight, you might be able to influence more than one or two properties. And so I encourage you to be thinking about this as we go along. And everyone comes to this for a different reason. You might have a problem that you're trying to deal with. You might have a new opportunity. You might have simply an unfulfilled promise to yourself or to your family members or to the future. Okay, so with that, let's dive into some solutions. The whole idea here is to try to think about ways that you can get rainwater to soak into the ground safely, away from any buildings that are important. Well, away from any buildings, I should say. Get it to soak into the ground. I'll start out with a couple of the heavy hitters. If you can disconnect your downspout from the storm sewer system, please do so. Of course, you have to give some thought to where that water is going to go. But that is one of the #1 things you can do. So when you get home, well, maybe not tonight, but tomorrow, at a time that's convenient for you, put on your galoshes, follow the mulch, find out where the water's flowing on your property, find out where your downspouts go, and start thinking about your own property and what kinds of contribution you can make. A lot of folks I know, including some really cool properties here in Lake Forest, people say, they're trying to pledge to say, I'm going to make sure that all the water that falls onto my property stays on my property, goes into the ground, goes into a plant, or gets used for some reason. That's a pretty neat commitment to make. For some of us, it's easier than others, and there are limits, of course, depending on you and your property and your wallet and things like that. But disconnecting your downspouts is one of the big ones. Another one that you can, another big heavy hitter coming out of the blocks is permeable surfaces. It's a big term. It just means it's a kind of surface like the one here that when the water hits this patio, a lot of it actually will infiltrate into the ground. Next slide, please. Plants are one of the biggest tools in your toolbox for all of these solutions. It doesn't have to be plants. In some cases, it's not going to be plants, but they can be fabulous to work with. And if done well, if designed well and maintained well, they can add a lot of value and beauty to your property and a lot of other benefits too. So for instance, certain plants can reduce your energy bills. Other plants are going to be able to help the pollinators, like the monarchs that are in such trouble right now, or they're going to be able to provide really important food for the songbirds that are migrating through the area in the spring and the fall, etc. So plants can be a real go-to tool here. All plants are not created equal, unfortunately. On the difficult side of the spectrum being the turf grass, the long grass. And the main reason there is that grass that's this tall has roots that are that deep. And that doesn't soak up a lot of stormwater. Plus, if your lawn happens to be very compacted, then it can actually be almost as bad as if it was asphalt in terms of stormwater runoff. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have lawn. There are different ways to approach your lawn. Sometimes, every situation is different, but there are ways to approach your lawn, sometimes just minimizing the size of your lawn or just the way you manage your lawn care. Rain gardens are an example of using plants for stormwater solutions. Now, I mentioned that turf grass is probably on the more negative side of good plants, bad plants, although it can be pretty awesome sometimes, like at Harvard University where they're using natural lawn care, and the roots are reported to be as much as 10 inches deep of some of those grass plants there. That's pretty neat. They're saving a lot of money too as they're doing that. On our website, we've got a lot of good resources for you if you want to learn more about elements of natural lawn care or full board natural lawn care. On the more positive side of plants that can work really well, the native plants are pretty phenomenal. Not all of them work the same as others, but some of them are very deep rooted. Anyone who's ever tried to transplant a silphium or a baptisia knows what I'm talking about. Some of them also have very fibrous root systems, some of the native grasses and such. So I'm not suggesting that you rip out every plant in your yard that's not native and replace it, but as you consider bringing more plants into your property, think about some of the benefits of the native plants. If you can, if your budget allows, I recommend that you work with a designer, someone who knows how to work with that type of a palette of species and who knows how to make it look beautiful. There's an unfortunate number of poorly designed rain gardens that I see torn out occasionally, either because people didn't understand the maintenance or the design of it wasn't really good to start with. Next, please. Rain gardens vary a lot. Sometimes we put them in a linear shape and then we call them bioswales. Sometimes we put them in a kidney bean shape and call them rain gardens. Depending on where they're located, we might call it a buffer garden. But basically what a rain garden is it's designed with plants that can take a bounce of water conditions. It can go from pretty wet for a couple of days to pretty dry during the dry season. So it's a suite of species that you can work with. Some rain gardens are highly engineered and need to be, where the property's been excavated and a substrate's been installed even, perhaps of pea gravel or some other type of more porous material, sand or gravel, etc. Other times, people are just taking a spot. It depends on the property and the soils, etc. But other times people are just taking a spot in between the building and the place where the water leaves the property, and they're planting a nice bed of shrubs or perennials or grasses that's collecting and infiltrating that water. So they vary quite a bit. And we always encourage people to look at where the water leaves your property, because that's the last chance to impact it. Next, please. So plant design and garden design ranges tremendously from the informal to the formal, and this is where personal taste comes in and your property. So there's a lot of different things that you can do, and you do want to think about what your neighborhood considers a good approach, because you're living with these people, and you want to think about what your spouse considers a good approach, because you're living with these people. You get the drill. You understand what I'm talking about. Next, please. This is a nice buffer rain garden right at the edge of a lake in the Mundelein area that just went in. Really nice. It's a last chance spot to capture that water as it's coming off of the neighborhood. Next, please. This is a pretty cool property in Highland Park. I want to tell you about several of their features that they've got here. They really wanted to reduce the impact of their building on the property. And right where this photo was, where we stood when we took this photo, about 10 feet behind us is the bluff edge going down to Lake Michigan. So this is right on the edge of the bluff there. So what they did first, you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner of the house is a green roof. And that's not for the faint of heart. When you undertake a green roof, you need to bring in someone who really knows their engineering, because that the structure's gonna have to be strong, and you're gonna have to choose carefully the plants that go in there and have a very good impermeable liner up there, and a good medium as well. But just getting that water from even getting into the gutters is the trick here that they've employed. And it looks really neat. They've also really reduced their air conditioning costs by doing this, because the house is much cooler. Then when the water does come off the building, it goes into these nicely designed beds. These are mostly native plants. This property owner has documented 96 species of native birds moving through the property. And so during the course of the year, the plants go through quite a seasonal change, and it's pretty neat. And then they still have their nice lawn there, but they make sure to do deep core aeration, and they reduce the amount of fertilizer that they use here also. On the front of this house, they have a cistern that's designed right into the facade of the house in brick. It blends in beautifully. It just looks like it was architected right into it. And then they have a really neat rain garden going along the side of the house, heading out. By the time the water gets to the bluff, it's pretty much been dealt with, which is pretty cool. Next, please. And just for fun, I had to show you another green roof. This one's on a shed in a house, in a property just south of Lake Forest. It's pretty neat, I think. Okay, so plants are a great tool, but you kind of got to know what you're doing, and you got to plan for their maintenance as well. Next. I mentioned earlier permeable surfaces. Whatever you can do, these are big ticket items. Whatever you can do, though, to reduce the amount of impermeable surface, give it some thought. I'm not saying go home and rip up your driveway, but if you are thinking of some renovations that are going on around your property, it's a neat one to be thinking about. These photos here are from Unilock. It's just one of many good companies that offer some pretty neat designs that have a very long shelf life and can lead to some really good results. Next, please. And the driveway is generally one of the largest areas that you can have an impact. Patio too, of course, if it's a large patio. Next, please. But even walkways. And almost all of these images I'm showing you, including this one, these are featuring native plants. They can look very formal or informal, depending on your personal taste and design. Next. A more engineered solution can be a French drain, also known as a dry well, where you've actually dug out a trench and you've lined it. This calls for some engineering, but it's something to be aware of. They can look very nice if they're done right. Next, please. And then the always famous rain barrels. And these may or may not be for your lifestyle. If you're not using the water in a rain barrel, that's okay. Next, please. What you can do, I just have to show you, there's some really pretty designs out on the market these days. It's pretty neat. What you can do with rain barrels, one barrel is going to fill up pretty quickly with some of the rains that we've been having these last few years. So if you're not emptying it fairly quickly, another thing that you can do is attach a soaker hose to it, or line up 2 to 3 rain barrels in a row, connect them together with soaker hoses that slowly drain them out of the area, or drain them out and away from the building. Next, please. You have to keep in, aren't these fun? You have to keep in mind that rain barrels need to be emptied and completely emptied and disconnected at the end of each growing season before winter. For a lot of people, I've seen that the rain barrel goes into the garage at that point and doesn't come back out. But what I think seems to work really well for a lot of people is if they attach it to the maintenance of their gutters. So in spring, and if you have a service that's taking care of your gutters, most of them will do this for you. In spring, when those gutters are getting cleaned out, great time to also hook up the rain barrels. And in fall, when those gutters are getting cleaned out, great time to disconnect and empty those barrels. And if you don't, they will fill with water, which will freeze, and they will crack open. So think about that. I'm running through these kind of quickly because I know I just want to introduce you to them. We've got a lot of information on all of these items on our website. Next, please. So I mentioned disconnecting your downspout, and the question is now what am I going to do with that water? I've already given you a couple ideas, but here's another one that you don't see that often. But the technology is pretty good now for these, and I know a couple people who have them. These are, we call these the bubblers. That's what I call them anyhow. There's another, bubble pots is what some people call them. And this is a diagram, but it gives you the general gist of the idea, is that it gets the water out away from the building, but then the water will bubble up in a flat area of your property, depending on your property again. Next one, please. And you can kind of see here how the technology of that works. The idea is just to get that away from the building so that it's not going to get into your foundation. Next, please. And then another really cool one that I'm seeing only a few places, but I'd love to see more of these. This is the underdeck bladder. If you've got a deck with a lot of empty space underneath, it's pretty cool. There's some rigid plastic ones out there, and there's some inflatable ones out there that I've seen. They're pretty neat, and they collect a lot of water. I've also seen people just use their canoe, but I don't know about that, because then you got mosquito issues. I should have mentioned earlier, a rain garden, if it's designed well, within 3 days, it is going to be empty of standing water, which means that it won't be causing any mosquito breeding. But anyhow, these underdeck bladders are great. They can collect a lot of water, which you can then use to irrigate the garden, irrigate the lawn, wash the car, wash the dog, any number of things that you want to do with it. Next, please. So those are some basic things to be thinking about. If you live on a ravine, just a couple of special requests or ideas for you to consider. One is what you do with your yard waste. If you can please not put any yard waste in the ravine, because piles of lawn clippings and piles of autumn leaves are going to cause the plants underneath those piles to die, and then that means that erosion is much more likely to begin. And once it begins with heavy storms like we've just had tonight, it can really start working its way down those slopes and cause some pretty serious gullies. So you would think that something as simple as lawn clippings wouldn't cause erosion, but they can if they're thrown on the ravines. Another thing is if you are doing any construction, whether it's of a new building or an addition, please think about keeping those buildings, those roof lines away from the edge of the bluffs and the ravines. Keep them back, because the pounding of that water coming right off of those roofs onto the ravine itself is really bad for it. It starts that erosion that we've been talking about. And one more, well, and if it's an addition that you're thinking about, if you can, think about going up instead of back, or think about coming forward instead of back. Those are just a couple ideas to throw out for consideration. And last, for people living on the ravines, if you can get water to drain to the front of your property rather than to the back of the property. Again, just giving it more time to soak in or go somewhere other than straight down those ravine edges would be really nice. Next, please. This is a nice property that incorporates quite a few of the things that we've been talking about, the permeable driveway and the native plants along with non-native plants, some really beautiful buffers, a lot of trees. You can get a lot of bang for a buck with trees these days, and we can always use a few more of them. So it can look really nice. Next, please. So I've introduced you in a very short amount of time to a lot of, some of these are big ticket items, some of them require engineering, some of them are, you've probably already been thinking about your properties. I'm running through this thinking, yes, 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 no, 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 maybe. So, where do you go from here? Obviously, you need to get to know your property if you haven't already looked at it. My hunch is if you're here tonight, you know what's going on with the water on your property. But we can help you out. So as I mentioned, Conserve Lake County is a 501c3 nonprofit. And in Lake County, we're the administrator of the very popular Conservation at Home program that's available in most of the collar counties in the Chicago area now. McHenry County is getting it next year. And what we do is we offer a service where you can schedule a visit on your property with one of our professional staff members, and we'll come out, we'll spend an hour and a half with you and look at a variety of things with you depending on what your needs are, so that you can get some real-time on-the-ground feedback from us depending on what we're seeing and what your passions and needs are and what your goals are. So we look at stormwater. We also look at if there are ecological treasures on your property. We want to make sure that by the time we leave, you're aware of those and you know how to protect them if possible. We look at invasive species. You hear so much about all these different invasive species, but we can help you find out which ones you might have on your property and what might be the best way for you to address those. And we're always ready with ideas of how to incorporate more native plants into your property. So, so that's a service we provide. And so, and then these folks here, you see the sign that they're holding. Next slide, please. This is the sign. If your property meets our certification criteria, we'll actually certify your property as well. And I brought copies of our certification criteria. It's also on our website. So I've got 2 handouts in the back about this program. And there's actually a number of people in the room who have certified properties. I know Patty's here and Jim. Anyone else with a certified property in the room? There's a couple of others here. It's pretty neat. And kudos to all of you for doing that. Next, please. So I've mentioned our website a couple times. I invite you to go there, get more information on these kinds of topics. You can learn about joining us. You can learn about how to sign up for a property visit if you're interested. And there's a lot of good stormwater information under the Conservation at Home tab. That's where I recommend that you head. So that's it. Thank you very much. You guys are great.
Our speakers, our wonderful speakers who came here because they're community-minded, wonderful people, would like to hear your questions. Does anyone have one?
This is a question that may be of concern to the League of Women Voters. Does Illinois law support retention of water on property, or does it reflect the concerns of a century ago?
Does anybody want to take that question?
I want to say that, first of all, Kurt is a attorney with the Environmental Law and Policy Center, no?
I'm turning it up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Engineer, okay. But he might, it's not just the League of Women Voters question. He might have some, or in Sarah May as well. As far as law goes, I am not aware that, actually, I don't want to say anything definitively. I believe that there is nothing in law that supports, that requires retention on property. I've never run into that. I can say that, pardon me? I do want to say that the League of Women Voters does support retention of water on property. It's one of the policy positions that we have established.
Okay, another question from the audience?
Can I add to that?
Certainly.
Thanks. I just wanted to add that wetlands are protected, and that's there are federal laws protecting wetlands, and that's retention of water on properties. And I wanted to, there's some really good resources in the room too, and I want to actually see, Patty, anything that we shall know about regarding laws?
Patty, can I give you the
I
microphone?
just have to say, part of the joy of gathering with groups like this is we can all learn from each other. Patty's with Lake County Stormwater Management Commission. That's why she's going to be a good resource for all of us.
So I think the question was, is there an Illinois law that prevents you from retaining water on your property? Is that correct? Not that I am aware of, no. No, not that I am aware of. The only Illinois law that I'm familiar with is the Illinois drainage law, and that basically prohibits a downstream property from backing water up on an upstream property and not taking it. In my opinion, everybody should manage the water on their own property. That's my opinion. I think that there might be policy and there may not always be a legal requirement.
Thank you, Patty. And Krista, did you have another answer?
I just want to say, I think that I agree with what she said, that everybody should do that, but we have to appreciate that not everybody has a property that can accommodate the water that's going to come off the roof right on their property. And so I don't think that it would necessarily be a good public policy to require that. And there's also, people have financial limitations as well. And, you know, we have to think of all these things. But, you know, certainly we should encourage people to do it.
Excuse me, is there anyone else that has another question? Okay, we'll be right back there. And the question here, a follow-up question, is what about the new construction? Again, what laws would be applicable to new construction for water retention on individual private property?
And there are watershed management ordinances that do require new construction to that fall within the criteria of the law. So usually there's some minimum, or actually size of the lot, that then they do have requirements, like building code, for example. It's the same kind of thing, where they would require certain retention measures be taken.
Okay, Kurt, Sarah, do you have any more follow-up remarks, or should we go on to the next question?
Well, I would just add that depending on where you live, there's going to be a variety of laws that impact construction. So it might be the county, it might be the municipality. So you really need to be looking into that carefully. And more municipalities now are starting to tax based on impermeable surface.
Okay, we have another question right here.
Can you tell us something about the regulatory authorities at the federal, the state, the county level, and how their jurisdictions interact? And in addition, how this coastal system impacts the authority of each of those three?
With regard to stormwater?
I'll share a bit what I know about what's happening in Winnetka. You may be familiar with a proposed project down there to build a tunnel to move stormwater from the east part of town into Lake Michigan, and they're just about to enter the permitting phase. And they will need a joint permit from the Illinois EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers. Help me out. There's at least 3 entities that they're going to have to convince that this is a good project. Federal EPA does not have jurisdiction, as I understand it, on that particular project, but for a certain scale of project, they certainly would come into play. So it's the Corps is more focused on the construction of it itself and the impact on at the outfall on the beach and the lake impacts, and the EPA obviously is more concerned about water quality. I know I'm leaving one out, so help.
Well, depending on what you want to do and where you want to do it, that's, you know, the property and the project are going to really dictate what kinds of regulations are going to be there.
So is there another layer of oversight because of this coastal designation or not? Does the Corps take care of that?
through the EPA.
The question was if there are other layers of oversight. Do we have an answer?
Because in the coastal zone, no, there, currently there are not. It's, and EPA.
And Department of Natural Resources and IDNR in
Yeah.
the state, right?
Okay, thank you. We have another question?
Wow.
So I've been looking into the Lake County, sorry, it was Sarah's topic on the conserve at home. And there were some erosion type of projects that we're looking into. I was curious if, depending on the municipality that you're in, if Conserve Lake County helps partner with the municipality. So for example, if you're trying to create a erosion control situation, that there would be some kind of liaisoning or partnership with that municipality to say, hey, I'm working with Conserve Lake County, to help with this. I didn't know if there was any kind of joint effort there, because I think my experience has been most municipalities just say permit, 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 or no, no, no. And I was hoping that if we had a nice green solution, that there would be some kind of, brokerage of a solution, or kind of a way to help them see the solution better.
We do support municipal efforts. Lake County has 52 municipalities, plus unincorporated Lake County, which is a large amount of land too. And so we work where we're invited. We have a good reputation. We're at the table for a lot of pretty big, important projects, which is really nice. And so I don't mean to keep having the same answer for every question, but depending on what's going on, we may or may not be in a position to help influence things in a good way. We have had a lot of success in many parts of the county. Not always, though.
Okay, more follow-up. We have one more question waiting.
Yeah, this question is for Kurt. I think one of the most astounding things I heard tonight, I almost blew me away, and maybe I heard it wrong, but you indicated the number of ash trees in a given geographical area that are going to be infected and will have to come down. How many are those again?
100,000 over the next 10 years.
Over what geographic?
That's lake forest, public and private property.
I mean, that's a forest.
It is.
And when you take 100,000 trees away with roots the size of the trees themselves, I'm sure that's going to have a terrific impact on runoff, I would think.
It is. And you're just starting to see the signs of it on public right-of-way and on the tree streets as they're doing the removals and some replacement. We can't afford to do a one-for-one replacement at this point, so it's about maybe 2 out of 10 are getting replaced, but we're just at the tip of the iceberg. It's going to be a huge problem for the community.
Okay, do we have one last question?
Just want to add a little bit about those ash trees. A regional tree census in the Chicago region found it's the most common tree. There's a couple of ash species, and virtually all of them are expected to die within the next 5 years. So plan now for some replacement, and it's impacting greatly municipal budgets. A diversity of native species is recommended.
Okay, one last question. I saw this hand go up first.
I'll just want to share some information, and this gentleman kindly reminded me that I should probably do that. And that is, if you work or live in a place that has like a detention basin or some sort of stormwater facility, and if you want to retrofit that so that you're using native plants and doing more infiltration, we have a grant program that helps cover the cost of doing that. And you could check the Lake County Stormwater Management website. It's called the Watershed Management Board. It's a small grant program. It is by far the least complicated grant program that I have ever experienced, and I am a professional at it. So if you want to, that's just an option for folks.
Okay, we'll take a mulligan and go with one last question.
Hi, I have a question for Kirk. you bring the stormwater in Lake Bluff and Lake Forest to the lake from Green Bay Road down. But the Winnetka Tunnel is talking about not going through any kind of wetland or ravine, but taking stormwater from West Winnetka, which is now on the other watershed from the subcontinental area, and bringing it directly into the lake. At issue is how they're going to be able to clean that up. And they're thinking about it, but they don't seem to have really good proposals. What are your thoughts on that? Should we be upset? Should we be concerned?
Well, I think we should all watch it very closely because it will impact all of us that live on the lake. The engineering firm that Winnetka has hired to do the detailed design and get them through the permit process issued their first report last week. And they shared that they've had many conversations with the Illinois EPA about what they need to demonstrate and what they need to prove to meet water quality standards. And the bar is pretty high. They have a lot of water sampling they're going to need to do over the next 12 months. They shared a bit of their plan of how they're going to do that. They have to get samples during dry days and post-storm days, and they want samples with snow runoff, so it'll be into the spring before they can do that. And they're under a lot of scrutiny, and it's a long-winded answer to your question. Fundamentally, I'm okay with returning water to the lake as long as it's of adequate quality and we're not doing more harm than good. But we have to watch that one closely because the volumes they're talking about are incredible.
All right. Well, I'd like to take this moment then to thank Krista Grimm, Kurt Volkman, and Sarah Saros for bringing themselves here to us tonight. Thank all of you for coming. You've heard the thunder start up again. I'm told we have a major storm cell on the way, so thanks to our sponsors, thanks to our presenters, and please be safe on the way home. Thanks for coming.